It's time now for the last 10 minutes, which, as it is Tuesday, means it's Green Tuesday. RFI's Rosslyn Hyams joins us to discuss issues related to climate change and the international COP21 conference due to begin in Paris at the end of next month. Hi, Rosslyn.
Hello, Philip.
And your guest today is Rob Youngman from the OECD, the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Hello. The OECD has just published a report on climate change mitigation and specifically on policies and progress. Now, the message, we'll talk more in detail about the report in a minute, but the message overall is that while there is progress, it's not enough to reach UN targets. Why is that?
That's right, Rosslyn. Well, what we find is now it's less than 2 months before COP21, the climate negotiations in Paris. And countries have set what they call intended nationally determined contributions for the period beyond 2020. What we're finding in our report on mitigation is that although there's a lot of action in terms of putting a price on carbon, addressing fossil fuel subsidy reform, and taking action across the rest of the economy, it's not happening fast enough. And I can tell you in more detail, but there are targets that have been set which will require a really accelerated level of reduction in very important countries such as the US and also in regions like the EU.
Now, the report focuses specifically on mitigation in OECD countries and partner countries as well, some of them being the BRICS. Mitigation is not the only field of action against climate change. It's part of a whole multilateral approach. So how then does this particular report fit into the debate or to action, in fact, at this stage?
Well, adaptation is another critically area of policymaking, and the report acknowledges this but focuses on mitigation, since that's where a lot of the attention is going into the agreement. Targets need to be quite ambitious to reach an agreement in Paris and to get on a path towards a 2-degree long-term climate target in the future. So this is why we focus not only on OECD countries to promote transparency and understanding in these areas, but also taking a look at some of the larger economies, the BRICS economies, where the growth of emissions is much higher. All countries are going to need to commit to a low-carbon track in order to achieve these targets in the long term.
So what does, you talked about going into things in more detail, what does the call for stronger action mean? Can you define stronger action here?
Sure. Stronger action means putting a price on carbon. This can be through direct carbon pricing, emissions trading programs like the EU ETS, and policies such as energy taxes, which we may not think of as a carbon pricing policy, but actually does serve to put an implicit price on carbon, as well as other regulations. The price on carbon needs to be at a level where it sends a clear signal to investors, to consumers, to producers that we're moving away from fossil fuels and toward a low-carbon economy.
Well, the type of carbon emissions mechanisms and trading systems are legion, if I've understood correctly. What mechanisms can actually check that governments are doing what they should be doing with, for example, tax revenues from carbon? And how are these systems evolving?
Well, you mentioned that there are a lot of systems, and it's true that national and local carbon taxes do exist. So in our study where we looked at the 34 OECD member countries, plus, as I mentioned, the BRICS countries and 4 others, these account for 80% of global GHG emissions. There's 15 countries that have national local carbon taxes. There are 16 emission trading systems, so starting with the EU, but this extends to Korea, New Zealand, Switzerland, Canadian provinces, US states, 2 Japanese cities, and very importantly, in 2017, a nationwide system in China, where they're going to bring together pilot programs. So there's a lot of carbon pricing programs out there, and they're expanding. But you asked a question about what will be done with the revenues, and so that you get revenues from an emissions trading scheme, for example, when you auction them. And there are trends in the program where there's increased use of auctioning over time in different programs. So the EU ETS has moved from 4% auctioning of allowances in 2008 to 12 to over 40% in phase 3. In California, which linked to Quebec's trading program in 2014, the coverage is 85%, and they have very significant use of auctioning in those programs as well. So this creates the opportunity for revenues. It's the decision of a country what they're going to do with it. Often they use it to address competitiveness concerns and to essentially reimburse parts of the population that are negatively impacted by trading, but often there's more than enough revenue that's generated to address that and other sources such as R&D or technology investment.
And all this within the framework of climate change. When we're talking about trading, it's all to do with climate change. We're not talking about trading commodities in general.
Well, that's an interesting question. In fact, they're creating a government-established commodity. An emissions allowance is a commodity established under the program. The purpose of it is to reduce emissions at the lowest cost. And the OECD has studied various regulations and different approaches for putting a price on carbon and has found that direct carbon pricing, like carbon tax, like emissions trading scheme, is the most cost-effective way of achieving reductions today. We also have to invest in technologies that will get us in the long term to a 2-degree target and eventually to net zero emissions by the end of the century, as our Secretary General noted in a speech this past year. You need advanced technologies, and so other policies are necessary. But emissions trading is the most cost-effective, and you can do it through emissions trading, creating this new commodity to minimize the cost of complying with the emissions cap.
Now, putting all this into perspective as well, there's the Carbon Alliance, and they've just called for global carbon pricing. I mean, you're talking about it in OECD countries, but there was a call for it on Monday to be worldwide, global. What does this actually mean, and what effect could it have at what levels?
Well, in September last year, the idea of a carbon pricing leadership coalition came about when 74 countries and over 1,000 companies expressed support for carbon pricing. This year, the OECD is participating in this coalition, and this includes a carbon pricing panel, which our Secretary General Angel Gurria participates in. It was announced yesterday, and they will, at COP21, kick off this carbon pricing leadership coalition. The purpose is to build and share the evidence base. So essentially proof that emissions trading and carbon pricing can be cost-effective, that there's ways of addressing competitiveness issues, that it doesn't have to cost the economy. In fact, the evidence so far with British Columbia and other countries is that it doesn't have a negative impact on economic growth, and there's actually significant economic opportunity around that. The idea is to coordinate policies, provide additional technical support to ensure that countries learn from each other's experience, and encourage the evolution of a global price over time where countries move together, coordinate to address competitiveness concerns. So everybody races to the top rather than to the bottom.
And just very quickly, these are all things that are being put into place that are going to take time and are going to go way beyond the COP21 in December in Paris.
That's right. It's a long-term target. And so success in Paris will mean clearly an agreement to move forward, but also a process by which you can revisit your targets and make it more stringent over time.
Rob Youngman, thank you very much for being with us today.
Thank you.
And thanks to both of you. And with that, we come to the end of this programme. Produced by David Coffey. Our engineer today was Alain Bleu. I'm Philip Tull. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you same time, same place tomorrow.